25 years of the relationship are rapidly coming unraveled. For India, it was the United States relationship with Pakistan in the first instance, but also with China. Peter Navarro, the trade advisor, and Caroline Levitt, who's the spokesperson for the White House, all three of them are pretty undisciplined in the way they use words. I don't know where he's going over the longer term, but right now he's going in a direction that's spectacularly unproductive.
Hello and welcome to deKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. You're watching Tracking Trump. Well, it's been a whirlwind of a week. First, US President Donald Trump met Russian President Vladimir Putin for an extraordinary summit in Alaska as he pushed for a peace deal with Ukraine. Later, he met the Ukrainian president with top European leaders to try and pave the way for a Putin-Zelensky meeting. Now, India has been watching all of this closely because Trump has slapped India with a 25% tariff for buying Russian oil. But with no deal closed yet on Ukraine, it's not quite clear what happens to these tariffs on India, which are supposed to kick in from the 27th of August. Interestingly, the White House trade advisor Peter Navarro launched a scathing attack on India in a piece for the Financial Times a few days ago, where he called India's trade with Moscow opportunistic and corrosive, while blaming India for funding Russia's war with Ukraine. He then lashed out at India for, quote, cozying up to Russia and China. However, the American hypocrisy on this isn't really lost on anyone. America's own trade with Russia has been rising, especially in fertilizers, uranium, and palladium. China happens to be the biggest buyer of Russian oil, but they're not getting slapped with extra tariffs. So the bigger question is, why is Trump really upset with India? Is it really about Russian oil or is it something else? And is the damage to the India-US relationship now a lasting one? Will India ever be able to trust America again as a friend and strategic ally? Joining us on the program today, Evan Feigenbaum. He was the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State looking at South Asia during the administration of George W. Bush in the late 2000s, and someone who has actually witnessed the transformation, the significant transformation in the India-US relationship over the course of the last couple of decades. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Feigenbaum. To begin, I actually wanted to quote from a piece that you recently wrote when all this tariff stuff started blowing up in India's face. And you said that Trump is actually tanking 25 years of a very hard-built relationship between India and the US. Do you believe that he's really caused huge damage?
I do. I think essentially 25 years of the relationship are rapidly coming unraveled. And the reason for that has in part to do with what you identified in the setup, which is the lack of trust between the two sides. But it also has to do with the fact that a lot of the assumptions and presumptions that undergirded the productive engagement between the United States and India have really come undone. And I'd highlight three things for you and for the audience. One is that throughout this 25 years, but particularly since 2008 when we concluded the nuclear deal, both sides were prepared to take fairly substantial risks domestically for the relationship. You remember Manmohan Singh put his entire government on the line in a trust vote. On the American side, the United States had to provide controversial fuel supply assurances, also to assure Congress on various things if terms of the deal were broken. On the Indian side, it's hard for me to imagine today either side taking a substantial or significant domestic risk for the relationship. Second, both sides objected to many aspects of the other's third-party relationships. For the United States, there were issues with India's relationships with Iran, with Myanmar, with Russia. For India, it was the United States relationship with Pakistan in the first instance, but also with China. But we never let those third-party relationships bleed back into the bilateral in a way that was completely debilitating and rode the relationship off the rails. Finally, I think the signal achievement of the last 25 years was really to give the relationship some lift beyond domestic politics. Foreign policy inevitably requires a firm anchor in domestic politics, or else it's too controversial to do anything. And since the trust vote in 2008 and the nuclear deal, this thing really had become fairly nonpartisan and been given some lift that depoliticized it on both sides. And as you and your audience know, in Delhi, it is completely a political football now. And the government is under some pressure to not look weak. And on the American side, I'm concerned that particularly on the MAGA right, a lot of the assumptions, as I said, about productive U.S.-India relations are coming unraveled. So when you add all that up, I think what I would say is, for a variety of reasons, most of which trace back to the peculiarities of President Trump, we're really in a bad place now, and a lot of what people like me work for has come unraveled.
I'm trying to understand, I think many of us are here, about why it's also become so kind of personal and nasty, in the sense that, you have President Trump calling India's economy a dead economy. You have the White House trade advisor, Peter Navarro, writing a very sort of stinging piece blaming India for funding Russia's war against Ukraine unfairly, many see here. And you also have now the White House in the last 24 hours describing the tariffs on India as sanctions. I mean, imagine using that word with a friendly country. Why do you think it's come to this? I mean, why is it so personal or seemingly so nasty?
Yeah, I don't think it's productive to psychoanalyze President Trump. The three people that you just named and identified, Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States, Peter Navarro, the trade advisor, and Caroline Leavitt, who's the spokesperson for the White House, all three of them are pretty undisciplined in the way they use words. Navarro in particular, I mean, he's a loose cannon. He says all sorts of things. And a lot of what he says is not well anchored in economic foundations and principles. I think my larger concern is not specific statements, although they're concerning, and I can see why they're unsettling to people in Delhi, but rather that the strategic foundation of the relationship has come undone. My boss back in the Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice, I mean, Condi would have, to be blunt about it, blown a gasket if somebody like Peter Navarro had circulated an op-ed article for the Financial Times like that. It never would have been allowed to be published as representing views of the administration. So what's broken down here is any kind of process in which more disciplined voices inside the administration should be tempering this and balancing American interests and reminding the president and others what America's strategic relationship with India is. So whether it's the Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, or it's others in the administration, something has come unraveled here. They either agree with the Navarro op-ed, they don't agree with the Navarro op-ed and just let it go anyway because they didn't want to take a political risk or a bureaucratic risk, or they just don't care. And all three of those scenarios are very unsettling for those of us who want to basically arrest the free fall we're in and put this thing back on a more productive trajectory. I think the reference to sanctions was badly chosen. You said earlier I worked on the civil nuclear deal. I mean, we all know the neuralgia in Delhi about the word sanctions, whether it's used as a rhetoric or whether they're actual. So that's spectacularly unproductive. So I guess the question now is who's going to put a process in place and remind the president why the U.S. has an interest in a productive relationship with India? I don't see it happening. And so I think the biggest concern I have now is how to put a floor under the free fall. And then it's going to be a long time to build.
But when you're dealing with a leader like Mr. Trump, do the people around him really have, for want of a better word, the courage to tell him the truth? Or does he like to be surrounded by yes men and yes women?
Whether they're yes men or not, they don't appear to have the courage to provide policy alternatives. So it's hard to know what they think is or is not the truth. But the point is, in a more conventional administration, you have a national security process in which options and policy balances are put in front of the president. The president can choose. This president seems to drive the train on almost everything. And I've often compared President Trump to what we call alternate side of the street parking in New York City, where I grew up. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can be on the left side of the street. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you're on the right side of the street. Depending on which side of the bed he got up on, he seems to follow whatever his instinct is. So there's not a lot of discipline here. There isn't a principled approach. There's not a strategic approach. It's basically personality, transactionalism, and a lot of rent-seeking behavior. That's not a kind of productive policy process. So my direct answer to your very direct question is I don't see anybody in the administration that's really tempering this right. Which puts a lot of the onus on the government of India, frankly, to think soberly about what India's interests are and whether India wants to continue down this pathway.
Which brings me to actually the next question, which is that what advice would you give to India at this time? Now, we had these trade negotiations that were going on for the last few months. Now the US trade delegation that was supposed to be in Delhi Later this month, they've called off their visit. We don't know when they're going to come. So for all practical purposes, those trade talks are not happening at the moment. How does India navigate this?
Yeah, I've been doing this a long time, and Americans always get in trouble when they try to give Indians advice on Indian policy. So I won't do that. I will just say, as an analyst looking from the outside, I think what both sides need to do is severalfold. The first is we clearly need to get to a tariff deal, because the 50%, when you layer on the 25% base tariff, the additional 25% on Russian oil purchases, and then potentially other tariffs and other kinds of penalties, it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable for the Indian economy, and it's unsustainable from an American standpoint for a productive U.S.-India relationship. So I think the de minimis is to get to a tariff deal, because it would put a floor, as I said, under the free fall, and then bound the problem a little bit. You don't need a lot of trust for that. I mean, the US and China don't have a lot of trust, but they're trying to reach an economic agreement as well. So I think that's entirely possible, notwithstanding that the talks have been put off. I think eventually, sometime in the fall, we can get to them. Second, the Prime Minister and the President previously had what appeared to be a fairly productive relationship. That may not be the case anymore, but it needs to at least be a functional relationship. And so at some point, we need the top two guys, but also the two administrations, to be communicating in a more productive and functional way. But I think ultimately what we really need to do is to give this some lift outside of politics again. That's where I think it's going to be most challenging. This thing is very politicized on both sides now. The Indian media, of which you're a member, the Indian public, the opposition in India, even within the government, there's a lot of pressure, clearly, not to knuckle under to American pressure. And as an analyst,
Yeah.
I understand that. On the American side, what I'll say is that President Trump is like the fairy tale character, the Pied Piper. There is an element of the political class and of the American body politic that will follow him anywhere. I don't know where he's going over the longer term, but right now he's going in a direction that's spectacularly unproductive. And one problem that we have on the American side is that a lot of the issues that are most salient for his domestic base, immigration, visas for tech workers, offshoring of manufacturing,
They all directly impact India.
Relationship in some way. So those domestic issues have the potential to bleed. I don't have a magic bullet to get out of that, but we do need to find a way to depoliticize this. And I think the first order of business is basically to try to get to a tariff deal. And Mr. Goyal can do that, I think, with Mr. Razdan.
Do you think that this unraveling of the US-India relationship is going to hurt the Quad and end up strengthening BRICS? And that's a road that's also, as you know, paved with so many landmines. India's relationship with China is very complicated. Even with Russia, maybe a little less complicated than the one with China. But is that going to be the inevitable fallout of this between the two countries?
It's an interesting framing, because you have two different questions there. What's the future of the Quad? What's the future of the BRICS? But ironically enough, they're linked by, in some ways, the same problem, which is that these are formats that were put together by a group of countries that are not always like-minded in all respects, and that have had to grope around for some meaningful function to fit with the form that's been created. If you remember how the Quad started, it actually started back in the mid-2000s after the Indian Ocean tsunami, when those four countries, Australia, Japan, the United States, and India, provided about 9 days of rapid and effective humanitarian relief around the Indian Ocean littoral. It was not a standing group. It didn't have a secretariat. They didn't meet at ministerials and summits. They didn't issue a lot of fancy schmancy communiques. In fact, the definition of success was the mission was accomplished and they put themselves out of business. So in those days, function drove form. What we have now is a group where form has been created, and it's spent a lot of time groping around for some meaningful function. That was already a problem even before we got into these tensions between the US and India. I think the Quad is going to have a problem, but the onus is really going to be in New Delhi to decide whether it's in India's interest to try to continue this. And then over the longer term, the question will be around how to make this thing cohere around some set of meaningful functions, notwithstanding the tensions within the group. grouping. The BRICS, ironically enough, has kind of the same problem. This is a group of countries that don't share a lot of interests. They have some differences. You identified India and China as one example, but there's others. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has the same problem. It's supposed to be a security grouping, but it includes India and Pakistan that have a lot of security tensions between them.
Exactly.
So again, when form drives function rather than the other way around, I'm deeply skeptical that either of those groups is going to cohere over the long term. I always thought the Quad had a better shot. I think a lot of what's happening in the BRICS now is performative and directed at shared grievance against the United States. But over the long term, I think what's really going to matter is sentiment-free balances of power and interest among these countries. And the core of this is really how the US, India, Russia, China quadrilateral is going to function over time.
Well, my final question is, which is what I asked right at the beginning in my introduction, whether India can trust America as an ally, as a friend ever again. Has a sort of a new state of distrust now crept in that we used to see during the Cold War, when India was more on the side of the Soviet Union and had not so great relations with the US. And do you think the fact that we have a very strong people-to-people relationship, we do have these community ties, skilled Indian engineers, tech workers, others who live and work in the US. I mean, there is a strong cultural sort of societal connect. And could that be something that helps the two countries overcome this current state of hostility?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think the Cold War is a good analogy, because when I think of the Cold War US-India relationship, my eyes go to 1970. And in 1971, India, frankly, really leaned to one side, and it wasn't the American side. What's more, we didn't really have, as you were saying, an economic relationship. So we've spent a lot of time clearing away the underbrush of the Cold War. And India's economic transformation has made a lot of things possible that were not possible prior to 1990. The nuclear deal was important in that respect, too. It wasn't just about trust building. It was about some practical realities. I mean, the Indian argument to the United States back in the mid-2000s through to when we finished the deal in 2008 was that the United States could not have essentially the privilege of having a strategic partnership with a country that was the number one target of its non-proliferation sanctions. And we've cleared a lot of that away. So I don't think we're going to have a rewind back to then. I think the problem is that, as you said, the trust is gone. So we could have a tariff deal, but the trust that was enabling a lot of other things is much harder to rebuild. Now, international relations is not based completely on sentiment. It can often be unemotional. I'm an old-fashioned balance of power guy. So I don't think the lack of trust or the unraveling of some of the trust that's been built necessarily means we can't do anything together. But I think the bar is going to be higher for both sides to demonstrate to each other that what we're trying to do together is in one another's interest. And I think the societal and economic connections are frankly a fragile reed. The United States and China had much deeper economic connections than the United States and India do. Much deeper, exponentially larger. That's come unraveled in just a few years' time. They're not exactly analogous because India and the United States are fellow democracies, but when you try to mitigate political risk by falling back on the non-political aspects of the relationship, a lot can change on a dime, and particularly with a president as mercurial as Donald Trump, this could turn on a dime tomorrow. And so I think it's harder to plan around risk and it's harder to hedge risk. And that worries me because I think when we're down to relying on societal connections, we're in a much more fragile and volatile environment than we ought to be in this relationship.
Well, interesting few weeks and months ahead. Evan Feigenbaum, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your perspective. You've had a bullseye, ringside view of how the relationship has developed over the last couple of decades. And thank you for giving us your insights today. Thanks. And we'll be taking a look at this story much more closely in the weeks ahead. Do join us again next time. Goodbye.